Well, good afternoon. I want to welcome all of you to the latest in our WIRES webinar series, where we have different speakers come in from the industry to engage us on issues that are of interest, particularly to those of us in the transmission area. And today we're fortunate to have with us Pamela Quinlan, who's the newly installed FERC Chief of Staff. Pamela has worked in the industry for about 15 years, and she's been at FERC since around 2015. Most recently, she joined the staff of then Commissioner Rich Glick as one of his technical advisors. And when President Biden named Commissioner Glick to the chairmanship, Chairman Glick, in turn, named Pamela as his, at least initially, acting chief of staff, and now more recently, she is the acting title has been removed. She's the chief of staff at FERC. So she's here to talk to us about her role as the FERC chief of staff, give us some insight into how she plans to work within that function, and talk a little bit about what some of the priorities are for FERC in the coming year. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Pamela, as she's got some prepared remarks for us. There is going to be the opportunity for our attendees to ask questions. I would suggest that as you think of questions, you raise your hand with the raise your hand function that's on the right portion of your screen, and Andrew will keep track of who has any questions for her, and we'll try to keep them generally in the order in which they're received. You can also submit questions through the question function as well, and we can pick those up. Unfortunately, we can't accommodate questions through those formats for people who are on the phone. You can try and text me your questions or email them to me or to Andrew, and we'll see if we can work them in. But we'll do the best that we can. Hopefully you have a lot of questions and you're ready to engage Pamela, and she's willing to respond to them to the extent that she can. I will mention that Pamela, I think all of our members are familiar with FERC and some of the restrictions on you may have on your ability to answer questions. So we'll try to avoid asking questions that we know you can't get into. We'll do our best. But in the meantime, let me turn it over to you. We're all anxious to hear what your thoughts are, and look forward to talking with you through some questions later on.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Larry, and thank you for having me here to talk about a little bit about my role and kind of what the Commission is up to in 2021. If you can advance to the next slide. So as Larry said, I'm now the Chief of Staff at FERC, which Chairman Rich Glick, when he became chair, named me. And I've been with Rich since he started at the Commission, but before that I was on FERC staff working in the Office of Energy Market Regulation with a particular focus on the East, which I brought some expertise to that area, as I've been previously, before moving down to DC, I'm a New Yorker, and I had most recently worked at Con Ed in New York, but had been around in the energy industry for a while in New York. I actually started with the demand response company. So mostly been focused on the electric side up until joining Commissioner Glick's office, and then my kind of portfolio expanded a bit to include some areas of gas and oil, but still mostly my expertise sits with the electric side. So what I'm hoping to do, actually, if you can advance to the next slide. So in my new role as Chief of Staff, I'm still an advisor to the chairman on a series of issues, but I'm now also responsible for basically keeping, that saying, keeping the trains running. So trying to make sure that the orders, we can get them out in a timely manner. We have now the benefit of having a full complement of 5 commissioners, which has been rare, at least for my time at FERC. But that also brings a lot of different perspectives, and it can make it a little bit tricky to get some of the orders out the door. So one of my goals is to make sure that commissioners are aware of kind of what the chairman's thinking and they have no surprises, that I'm a point of contact for them to raise any of their concerns, policy or otherwise, and try to help make sure we can count votes, to kind of walk the, at this point, virtual halls, but make sure that we kind of know where these orders are going so we can get them out the door. And then, outside of the commissioner's offices, I'm kind of the point person for what at FERC we consider senior staff. So we have a series of program offices that focus in different areas, like the Office of Energy Projects or the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation. I'm the point person for those offices in the chairman's office, and my goal there is to just make sure that what they're working on aligns with what the chairman's priorities are, that they have the information that they need and the resources they need to be successful in their roles. And we're very lucky to work with them. I mean, the staff at FERC is by far regarded as some of the best in government, and they've earned that title. And it's another reason why we keep being one of the best places to work. So, and back to promoting the chairman's priority is more than some of these things are things that are kind of standalone efforts. Other ones are really thinking about how to incorporate them across all of our orders. So we have a lot of priorities. When I was putting together these slides, I was trying to think of how to characterize them. I have them down to 6, and I'm happy to talk. I'll be digging a little bit more into the transmission planning and generation interconnection reform in the future slides. But to start off with, in terms of modernizing resource adequacy in wholesale markets, we know that it's no secret that the grid is under a kind of massive transformation. And as we see these increasing amounts of new renewable resources come online, a lot of these state policies are driving it, along with some federal policies and consumer preferences. We may need to kind of think about what the markets are going to look like in the future. So we recently had our kind of first workshop in a series that we'll be doing about kind of modernizing electricity market design. And in the beginning, we were talking a bit about the MOPR rules, which the chairman has probably spoken more about MOPR than anything else as a commissioner. So his views on it are pretty clear. And we think that we need to address some of the problems that MOPR, that the current minimum offer pricing rules, which are really kind of obstruct some state policies in these markets, need to be addressed. But it doesn't stop with kind of looking at MOPR. We need to think about what is the kind of long-term goal of these capacity markets in an environment where resource entry and exit is being driven by more than just plain least cost economics. And how do you think about whether energy and ancillary services markets need to be reformed to address the emerging needs of the system. So that's an area where I think we're going to have a lot more tech conferences on this year, and we're looking for some more feedback. We'll have some post-tech conference questions issued from the conference we had last week, and really hope people are participating in that. The second item is the transmission planning and generation interconnection reform, which I'm going to hold off talking about until I get to the next slides, and I'll just briefly touch on some of the others here, particularly after what happened in Texas and the central and southern plains. We know that these extreme weather events are causing some really new challenges on the system that may have happened to somewhat before, but they're happening more frequently, whether it's kind of wildfires, the extreme cold weathers, hurricanes. These are issues that we really need to understand whether the tail risks are really tail risks anymore, and whether we need to be kind of planning and operating our system in a different way as these challenges are just occurring more frequently. So that is another area we will be having a technical conference, and we've issued some questions to get feedback on how to think about this. And the initial questions are really there to help staff kind of plan out this tech conference and define the scope of it as we really work to really have a more forward look as to where the markets, where reliability, how we think about this, how does it need to evolve. And there's also the ongoing inquiry that we have with NERC on what actually happened in Texas and SPP and MISO in the beginning of February. On the policy on the certification of natural gas pipelines, LNG facilities, this was an NOI that was initially issued under then Chairman McIntyre, which we recently reissued with some more specific questions that really get to like how to do some of these things. So notably at the last meeting, for the first time, one of the orders on Northern Natural considered the significance of the greenhouse gas emissions. But in terms of trying to come up with a framework to do this more broadly, that's something that we're really looking to engage with industry on through that NOI process. That's another major priority. Enforcement, you may have noticed at the last meeting, there was actually an enforcement item on it. This is something that continues to be a major priority for the chairman, and our enforcement division is excellent, and we continue to work with them closely. The Office of Public Participation is an office that is currently getting set up. As you may know, we're having listening sessions. We've had a few already. We have another one coming up in the evening. There'll be a upcoming workshop on this, and the goal with the Office of Public Participation is to really kind of have it up and running probably in time for about October. So there are a lot of priorities. Luckily, we have a lot of people who work at FERC who are excellent, who can kind of take these on, and happily they're across kind of all of our divisions. But if we can go to the next slide, I'll dig in a little bit more on transmission. So we've been talking a lot, I've been talking a lot about kind of how our priorities really are aimed at where things are headed. And I think for transmission planning, and when we think about this, you look at the future, the demand for renewable energy is just growing rapidly. When I was thinking through kind of how to talk about this today, the state policies are one thing, and some of them are very aggressive. We know consumers are making their preferences known, and then yesterday we heard the announcement of the 30 gigawatts of offshore wind in 9 years coming out of the Biden administration. And when you think about all of these goals for renewables, there's just no way to bring them all online without a massive expansion of our transmission system. So we know we're going to need more transmission, and we know we need to figure out a way to get these resources online. But the interconnection queues are still very clogged up. They're long and slow, and we've done efforts at FERC, and the different regions have taken things on. But despite those efforts, we are still seeing quite a backlog in the interconnection queue. And this is something that, when you think about the transmissions that's needed, the way that, at least I'm thinking about this, and I should have mentioned from the beginning, I only speak for myself. I do not represent the chairman or anyone else at the commission. But at least how I'm thinking about this is that the transmission, any transmission reform really needs to be thought about with generation interconnection, because we really need to figure out how to get the transmission system built out to bring all of these resources online in a way that's cost effective. Can you go to the next slide? So as we think through this, some of our priorities right now that we're trying to understand is kind of how do we align generation interconnection and transmission planning, so that, not only looking at kind of what's in the queue now, but where we know these resources are going to be built. Because if we are waiting and kind of building out transmission lines one at a time, thinking about offshore wind, you can build a bunch of tie lines out to every single wind facility, or you can kind of be more forward thinking and develop kind of a platform off the shore that may provide other benefits. So one of the things that we're thinking through is whether or not the current approach with the Order 1000 in the regions will really allow those types of transmission projects where the transmission really is built ahead of or before the generation is actually there to interconnect. But it seems that if we don't do that, if we're not taking steps to plan out the transmission system to be able to meet the needs that we know are coming, that it's really going to be an inefficient build out of the system that could result in additional lines that are both costly and that had we thought it out ahead of time would not be necessary, which could impact additional communities. If we're not building them to the right voltage in the first instance, it could also over the long term cost a lot more money. So, I think the way that I'm thinking of it now is that if we are not able to attack transmission planning reforms and generation interconnection reforms kind of together, that we're not really going to be able to build out the transmission system to meet the needs that we know are coming based upon the actions by state and federal government, along with the different consumer preferences that have been mentioned. So that's kind of a very high level overview of how we're initially thinking about this. And, I guess at this point, I'm happy to take some questions. Not sure, Larry, if you had some to start with. I might have blown through that a little bit fast. It's hard when you don't see anybody on the other side of these boxes, but that was a lot of priorities to go through. But transmission planning and generation interconnection is one of our top priorities, and it's something that we realize that we need to take some steps here to get the transmission needed built. So.
Well, no, thanks, Pamela. I appreciate that. You actually covered quite a fair amount of territory in a pretty quick fashion, but you kind of hit the highlights. Just as I was listening to some of what you were going through, I definitely came up with some questions. So what I'll do is I'll ask you a couple of questions just to sort of to get some of this started. I would encourage our attendees to, again, raise your hand or submit questions as they have occurred to or do occur to you as the discussion goes on. One of the things I wanted to ask you was, you actually, I thought were pretty kind of specific when you were talking about the Office of Public Participation, because I thought I heard you say you were looking at what you thought would be like an October timeframe for that office. And I guess I'm curious, to the extent that you've been able to think through it, or you have a sense where the commission may be going on it, what do you see that office looking like? What would it be doing? You know, I can tell you there's a lot of questions from the outside as to what that would involve and what it would be like. So to the extent that you've given any thought to it, I guess we'd be interested to hear. Does it play a role in transmission? Is it more education oriented? Is it more active in issues and proceedings? I'll stop asking questions and I'll let you talk, and then I can follow up on that.
Sure. You know, so we're still in the early stages of this, and recognizing it's a very short time frame. We have a report due to Congress on what we're going to do here with kind of an operating budget and some plans. But essentially, as I understand it, and you know, Commissioner Clements is kind of the chairman's asked her to kind of lead this effort to start it up, and there's some excellent folks working on it that could explain it better than I can. But really the goal here, as I understand it, is to make sure that the folks have an ability to get involved in our proceedings so that they actually have a voice that can be heard. It can be very complicated, as everyone knows on this call, to get involved in these FERC proceedings. You know, an easy example would be like a landowner in some of the gas pipeline proceedings. These are tricky areas. It's not clear who to kind of call. And, you know, we shouldn't only hear from folks who can, like people who can afford to have, like Washington attorneys, these expensive law firms, as my boss likes to say, to come and represent you. That there has to be an ability to kind of get some feedback, and that goes particularly to some of these historically disadvantaged communities that are oftentimes affected by our projects, making sure that we are like doing outreach and hearing kind of their feedback, tribal communities as well. And, you know, people ask a lot, is this just on the project side or is it on electric? And my understanding is that it'll be on both, that we really do want to be able to kind of help get people information that they need, do some outreach to get folks at the table who generally aren't, and have a point of contact and who they can reach out to ask questions. So it's not going to be an easy job, I don't think, to set up this office, or certainly not to run it. And you know, the listening sessions right now are really to gather some feedback on what that looks like and how best to accomplish it. But from my viewpoint, the goal there is to be able to have a plan by which we can really target and reach these communities that are usually not involved in our proceedings, make sure that they have the information and have the ability to have their voices heard, that they best can represent themselves, and we just need to make sure that we can facilitate that. So I don't expect it to be fully, you know, at its full operation entirely by October, but I think there'll be something up and running by then, is at least my initial understanding, or sometime this fall. Maybe October is not exactly precise, but I know the goal is to have something up and running there, and it might expand in scope over time. But this office has been a long time coming, so it's exciting that it's finally getting off the ground.
Yeah, so I guess just to follow up a little bit on that, it sounds more like helping others for them to be able to participate, as opposed to the office having staff that would participate itself within the proceedings, kind of like the trial staff does in other proceedings.
You know, we're still, we have our listening sessions. We're gonna have a workshop to tease out some of these different ideas and gather some feedback on exactly how it should be structured. So I don't want to get ahead of that and say exactly how it would work, but I think the goal is to allow to be able to reach these communities and have their voices be heard and make sure they can represent themselves. Now, if there's an additional role for FERC staff to do more intervening on behalf of entities, or what might happen with intervener funding, I know that might be a question you're about to ask. A lot of that has to be worked out, and I think we're looking for some feedback, and that's there's been a lot of really helpful information gathered already from the listening sessions, and we look forward to hearing for more, getting more feedback during the workshop. But this is a major priority on a short time frame, so it's going to get pulled together and hopefully be in place for the fall. And I don't want to foreclose that there might be an opportunity for staff to do, for staff within the Office of Public Participation to take a more active role in proceedings. I just know that the goal in general is to make sure that those the communities and people who might be hard to participate in proceedings today have an ability to do that.
Good. So I had another question, and I'm already getting some questions coming in by email and text from people on the phone, and actually they overlap with something I wanted to probe a little bit more, which goes to, you talked about some of the challenges associated with transmission planning and interconnection issues as well. As the commission starts to think through or figure out what it wants to do with respect to these issues, do you have some even early sense of what the process for something like that might involve? Are we looking at outreach by the commission? Are we looking at workshops or technical conferences on different issues? And then just even from a further process perspective, is it something that would lend itself more towards a piecemeal approach, focusing on different issues, or one kind of larger effort that is a kind of a big, more comprehensive, whatever it would be, rulemaking or whatever the ultimate action is the commission would wind up taking? Just curious to the extent that you've thought through some of those questions.
Sure. So, I don't think we want to wait until we can act on everything to do everything all together. I think that will probably take too long, and it would kind of rob us from some benefits that we might be able to get in the short term. So we're working now and trying to gather some feedback through some targeted outreach and kind of going also out of our recent efforts on generation interconnection and some of the feedback we have in that proceeding, which is to look at, is there anything we can do in the short term that might at least help a bit to move these things forward. And there might be some areas there by which we can potentially look at some of the challenges in the generation interconnection, and whether or not, some of the regions that do, for example, they look at studies, they look at each interconnection like serially rather than like in a cluster approach. And maybe that's something worth exploring as to whether or not they should, we should be looking at these studies in terms of like grouping together interconnections into clusters. It would seem like we could explore some of that stuff in the short term. I think potentially in the medium term, trying to figure out, is there a way that regions right now, and at least it's my impression that the current planning process doesn't really allow, or it certainly doesn't facilitate the planning of transmission to meet kind of these future needs where we know generation will want to interconnect. So I think tackling that question, like how do you build the transmission, whether it's offshore before the offshore wind turbines are actually even in the queue or built, or onshore out into these regions where we know there are like renewable rich areas where we're expecting those resources are going to need to interconnect in that area to be able to meet these goals set by states and the federal government, as well as kind of consumer interests. How can the planning, how can we have the planning process actually plan for those and cost allocate those projects? And to me, I think that's kind of a medium term objective. And then I think over the longer term, I do think there's other challenges. I think they require a little bit more of a holistic look at different, areas like why, like the interregional challenge is huge. Like, right now interregional projects, to basically get over the burden, the kind of the requirement to kind of displace projects in your region, or how you actually think about interregional projects, it makes it really challenging for those to get built. And is there something that we can do there? It's not it's not completely clear. I think there's more record building on some of these other initiatives that might take a little bit longer to get to. So Larry, I think to your question, are we looking to do this kind of all in one fell swoop? I don't think so. I think we're trying to pull out kind of what we can do in the short term, the medium term, and kind of the longer term. And I also think there's a role there for kind of potential looking at oversight. You know, there's real concern, particularly we have new commissioners in the current makeup of the commission. I think there is some concern there about whether or not the transmission spend we've seen kind of has been necessarily warranted. Obviously, there's some pending things, but across the board, but there's, you know, well-known concerns about kind of what incentives the current Order 1000 framework has for like building like more local projects rather than building these larger projects, and whether there needs to be some kind of additional oversight earlier in the process rather than waiting to go through like the protocols and then coming and bringing something to FERC for prudency review. Is there any additional oversight that's needed? And that might be something to kind of look at over the longer term as well. So, you know, we're still figuring out kind of where things fit into those three buckets, but at least initially kind of looking at what's possible in the short term. Is there a way in that medium term to really start to require the planning of transmission for future needs for generation interconnection? And then I think over the long term, there's a host of challenges, particularly with interregional and some oversight and some of the, I guess, maybe unintended consequences of Order 1000 that require a closer look.
Well, Pamela, that's actually a great segue to one of the questions I just got from somebody, which is, says here, you briefly mentioned Order 1000 reform. That was earlier. Do you have some initial thoughts in what direction that reform would go? Is there information that FERC would benefit in seeing to better understand from the industry perspective what some of the pain and pinch points are? And also, and this goes to something you referred to in your remarks you just gave, is there an opportunity to provide a counter narrative to the notion that local transmission is being worked on to avoid competition? I know that's something that we hear about quite a bit as well. So curious as to what your thoughts are on those points.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points. I think there's going to be a way to get feedback. I don't know if the feedback is going to be through like the different procedural vehicles. You know, this is a commission who likes to have tech conferences. A lot have been announced. I wouldn't be surprised. You know, I think there are going to be some kind of workshops or tech conferences at some point in the future. I don't know that that's the first step that comes out of the commission on this. It could be an NOI to get some more paper on it so that people can read the record. It could be potentially like an ANOPR to lay out kind of the theory of a case of a problem. There's different procedural vehicles. We can't get anything out without getting 3 votes for it. So, you know, this is not I do not think it's a good idea for the commission to kind of go into a corner and work by itself and come up with a new idea. I think the goal here is to, you know, in the short term are areas we probably have enough information on already based upon prior proceedings. I think this medium term effort on building out transmission to facilitate like the longer term generation interconnection is going to require some real feedback from industry. And I think a lot of conversations about that, because, you know, I think coming up with the right way to do that, it's not going to be easy, and I think it'll be really helpful. And to the narrative, to the question about the narrative as to why, you know, local transmission spend has been up, and you know, it's been really helpful over the years for me, at least, to meet with a lot of folks who've broken this down, who've explained to us like why some of that was really deferred investments from previously. There's lots of very good reasons for it, and I don't mean to suggest that oversight is needed because it's such a problem, but as much as just even the narrative alone can be very problematic. So potentially having some oversight as maybe even like an independent check on this might stop some of the kind of infighting on this and some of the challenges that get brought to the commission. It does seem like it's certainly a hot issue that we've heard so much about, although, you know, again, as far as I have seen and what people have brought, there does seem to be some good reasons for why a lot of those investments were made. But regardless of whether those investments were warranted, I think most would agree that we're not seeing the kind of transmission that is going, like that transmission getting built now that we're probably going to need to really be able to bring on board, bring online and integrate the amount of renewable resources that we need to. And it from right now, our working theory is that absent reform, we're not going to be able to build the transmission system out to meet that. And that doesn't mean that, you know, we shouldn't take a look at some of the concerns people have raised about local projects, but that the concerns, but even if those concerns are valid, trying to look at local projects isn't really going to address the fact that these larger kind of regional or interregional projects aren't being built. And I think that's probably going to be the focus in the medium term.
We've got another question that came in that comes from a little bit of a different angle. It says that we all agree the future is more electrification of load and penetration of more renewable generation that will be combined with the need for more transmission. And the question is, have you and the commissioners and FERC staff given some thought to the fact that this is going to have long-term bill impacts on customers? And that utilities need cost recovery in order to make these investments. Just curious as to, you know, how FERC has already started to give some thought to those consequences that will flow from all of this need.
Yeah, so I think, that's our primary, outside of reliability, ensuring just and reasonable rates and making sure that we keep in mind who's paying for this is critical to our work. So I guess two things I'd mention about that. I think the first is that if we're not right now, the way that we're thinking about this is that it's not that we want to build more transmission than is necessary, and that's what we're looking at here, but that if we're not really being thoughtful and taking a longer term look at this, then it's like someone said recently, it's like building you would never build a highway one lane at a time. It would be silly and it would be incredibly expensive. If we know we're going to need a lot of it, if we can build the transmission once in one area and we can plan that out and make it really like a good place for which resources can interconnect, that may actually save a lot of money over the long term. And that goes directly to but there's no way around it. Building out transmission is going to cost money, but we're going to need that transmission to interconnect these resources that are coming online. So exactly who pays for that and how that works, I think those are all the questions to be asking. But I think the effort here is to make sure that the transmission we're building out is the right transmission, it's efficiently planned and built, and that that we're actually getting the most out of it. And some of that goes to a point that I didn't hit on before, which is also taking a look at how we actually can get the most out of the transmission we actually have, or the transmission that we're going to build. And that some of those grid enhancing technologies, which in some areas like SPP, the studies that they have shown, I think Brattle came out with one recently, is showing significant savings with the amount of additional capacity that could be used on that if you actually have some of these grid enhancing technologies. So really looking at how to get the most out of the system we have, how to build out the grid in the most cost effective and efficient way to meet the kind of future needs, and doing that in strategically where we're planning smart, so that we can pay it's certainly not going to be cheap to build out the entire transmission system to integrate the amount of renewables that are being targeted right now, but it's certainly if not planned out smart, could certainly be a whole lot more money. So I think that that's a very good point and something that we need to make sure is a focus of kind of our discussion and record building in these areas.
And your work and outreach with the states as well, I would assume, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is an area, the commission in the past has been criticized for not coordinating well enough with the states. I think it's been a little bit of difficult over the pandemic, because we normally at the different neighborhood meetings throughout the year, the commissioners, the state commissioners and the FERC commissioners get a real chance to talk one-on-one. I know the chairman really enjoyed those meetings and being able to talk to the states directly. And so it's a little bit harder now, but figuring out a way to better work together on the areas where like we have the kind of overlapping jurisdiction, particularly on transmission, is going to be critical. I think, the states, and we see things like, the state of New Jersey and PJM wanting to work with the state agreement approach with PJM because they're trying to figure out the best way to build out, the transmission they're needing to integrate the resources they're looking for. And, the states have their goals, and if there's ways in which we can coordinate and help the states kind of work together to build a more efficient transmission build out, whether that's, again, offshore or onshore, I think that would be in the interest of everybody. So but those conversations, understanding kind of like what the role of the RTOs would be in that, how to work with the states, it's just going to be require a lot of cooperation and discussion, and something that I know that's really important to a few of our, a few of the commissioners right now, is kind of improving our relationship with the states and making sure that that dialogue is open and fruitful as we continue to kind of chart our path forward on transmission.
Great. I'm going to pause for a minute and check with Andrew. Do you have any questions that people have their hand raised waiting to ask?
I am not seeing any raised hands, Larry. So
they all want to hide behind me.
But quite a few in the queue for you, for what it's worth.
I was going to say there are more coming in, but if anybody does want to raise your hand and ask a question, you should feel free if you want to talk directly to Pamela. I'm going to ask one here. This has to do with kind of following on your advanced technologies point that you were making earlier. It says high performance technologies are often excluded from consideration due to higher first costs, even though they have a proven ability to produce large net benefits. And they're curious, what is the commission doing to encourage transmission owners to move away from the traditional emphasis on first costs and towards a design approach that maximizes net benefits and benefit cost ratios?
That's a good question. I think we started examining some of this with in our incentive rulemaking, and we have some feedback on that. Right. The question becomes kind of what's the right way and the best way to do that, and I think we're still really gathering information on how to think that through. There's been some really interesting proposals out there about shared savings. There's been some thoughts that should be a requirement for planning to show why that they're not doing that, and in the regions, in the transmission planning region, and their studies. So I think there's different ways in which FERC can approach that. I don't think a path has been chosen, and I think some of that requires a bit more feedback and discussion. Some of these technologies are further along than others, and it's an area that we need to keep learning about. I think there's a distinction when it's easier when we know it's the good thing to do everywhere than like if it makes sense in some places and not others, and what's the right way to approach that in that instance. And as I said, there's been some pretty innovative proposals that are before the commission on how to do that I think we're still evaluating.
Another question that came in is, this one's focused on coordination, and it's in the context. It says that there's been a lot of discussion about the need for coordinated transmission for offshore wind, but there are also needs for coordination and proactivity on land-based wind and solar. So where the timelines and developer expectations are sometimes way beyond the study timeframes, including ISO needs, not to mention transmission siting and construction durations. They're curious if you can either say more, or has the commission given any thought on how there can be more proactivity or coordination in those areas as well?
Yeah, I think the kind of coordination between the generation interconnection queue and transmission planning is going to be key. And how do we think about that? What exactly does this transmission get planned out for? And if you're planning out, if there are some broader benefits outside of just to the interconnecting generator, kind of how do you define those, and can you actually plan out the transmission system in advance before those resources are there to interconnect? I think that's an area of real focus for us that I think we want to learn more about, but it does seem like it's going to be key to building out an efficient system to integrate the resources is to really have the RTOs and ISOs in those types of regions actually plan out the transmission system to incorporate kind of not just what's in the queue now, but where it's going to be expected. I think it's tricky knowing that the queue right now, I think it's only like 15% or something actually get built. So this is not a simple thing to do. But you know, if we kind of keep continuing on the path now, it's just so slow and it's difficult, and there's a lot of challenges there in terms of how do you thin out the queue, how do you expedite the process, how do you get the projects that are not real out of there. There's a lot of times there's reasons why people will kind of put projects in multiple places trying to figure out the best way to interconnect. Now that's helpful if you want to have efficient interconnection, you want them to be where it has like kind of the lowest cost way to interconnect. That's a benefit of that, but that also kind of can clog up the actual queue. So you know, one way to think about that is are there other ways, whether they're cluster approaches to studying this, if there are potential reforms to participant funding that might actually end up like helping out to build out the transmission system. So, you know, and then if you look at participant funding, but don't actually then address kind of some of the inefficiencies that the removal of those costs would cause, that actually can end up clogging up the queue work. So I think there's a balancing of needs here that really need to be considered, but I think the objective is to figure out a way to kind of expedite the queue, get these resources online faster, help kind of speed up some of these studies, and potentially build out the actual transmission system in advance to kind of allow those resources to interconnect. That's at least how I think I'm thinking about it.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about environmental justice, because that's a topic that you're seeing coming more to the forefront these days, and even Chairman Glick has picked up on it, has talked about the need to factor that more into the commission's processes. I guess I'm curious as to what thoughts you can share on, he mentioned the bringing on somebody to kind of look across offices on environmental justice issues. How would that work? Is it focused on the pipeline certificate process? Is it broader than that? Do you have any sense as to what he has in mind with that role?
Yeah, so we're still looking to hire someone for that position. It would be a senior position with hopefully someone with deep expertise on environmental justice. You know, I think even 5 years ago, if you mentioned this to me, I probably wouldn't know exactly kind of what that meant. So, you know, I think a lot of us are still learning about this, and we could use some more expertise at the agency on it. Although the folks who have worked on environmental justice, particularly in our pipeline certification, they, you know, we do have a good amount of people now working on it now with some deep expertise. But to your question as to whether or not this is like solely for kind of our project side of the agency, or is it also broader than that, I think the answer is it's broader than that. You know, like we need to really think through how our decisions that we're making are affecting people. Even going back to the question, you know, in some of this, you know, some of this goes down to our conversations with our state partners. Some of it goes down to kind of retail rate challenges. You know, in areas like in the recent cold snap, there were some challenges in a part of MISO where they actually kind of elected, as I understand it, to like not build more transmission to keep the costs down, and they kind of rely upon a local peaking plant to kind of serve their needs. And then under stressed conditions, they are having, then they're also, they don't want to raise the bills because it's a pretty poor community, but then they also, so they haven't planned out the transmission system to really reinforce that area to keep the customer bills down. And but at the same time, you know, they then have this disproportionate outages there. So there's not necessarily a solution to all of this, as much as that we need to make sure that we're thinking through how the decisions at the agency are really impacting communities, particularly the ones that are been historically disadvantaged. So bringing somebody in with that expertise will be hugely helpful. I think that they would do is then work across the agency, not just within the Office of Energy Projects, but also across on the electric side as well, to really help us kind of figure out how we should be thinking about that. On the project side, you know, this is an issue that the chairman raised then when he was a commissioner, with some of the projects in Brownsville, which is one of the most well-known EJ communities, and kind of when you think about the requirements of how we looked at the impact of that when we were considering some of the facilities there, it was that, you know, there was no disproportionate impact to the minority communities, because I believe they were kind of all economically disadvantaged or minority. And, you know, the chairman had quite a strong dissent on that, because that's not the way that that does not feel like the way that we should be dealing with this, that we, you know, need to do a better job of really thinking through how our decisions are impacting these communities. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And we're still looking for someone to kind of come in and fill that spot, but hopefully we'll have some news on that soon. And we really can start to work through these challenges at the agency. And, you know, FERC's not alone. It's something that the agencies across the government are really learning to grapple with and to think through kind of what these considerations mean and how to incorporate them into decision making. So we're learning more, and we'll be probably have more to say on that in a few months from now, but it isn't just on projects, it is across kind of our entire agency.
I got a question here that came in related to RTOs and the value of RTO membership. And one of it starts off with have recent events, recent reliability events in many states in any way changed or altered the view of FERC on RTO membership? Has the value of being in an RTO been enhanced by those events or experiences? And are there any, just as other incentives, that FERC is considering to be part of an RTO? I can tell you, elaborate a little bit on this, which is I've heard this with increasing frequency from different utilities, just talking about the increasing challenges of being in an RTO. A lot of focus has been on the benefits, which I think there are a lot of them associated with RTO membership. But what we're not seeing so much is the challenges for the companies that are in RTOs that they are seeing increasingly over time, and how you kind of continue to maintain that balance. So I think that's really where that one's coming from.
I think that's a good question. I think what we saw recently is certainly some of the, in terms of what we're saying, the reliability challenges, is certainly the benefits of coordination and regionalization, and being able, you know, certainly better ties between neighbors, I think is definitely true. And you know, I think the commission in its current makeup, as it has in the past, are still strongly supporting of the RTOs and ISOs. I think the question as to whether or not, you know, the challenges put on RTOs that are not put on other regions, you know, how does the commission consider that? And I think those are good points to raise. You know, I think, you know, a lot of times kind of our rules are sometimes go only to RTOs and ISOs, which put more burdens on those areas than others. And, you know, a lot of times, maybe some of the time, those decisions maybe should apply outside of RTO and ISO regions. And I think that's really important feedback to get, and for us to consider, to continue to think about. In terms of incentives, I know, you know, there's been a question, and you know, the chairman's been has spoken out previously on some of the RTO adders in the transmission incentives framework. I think, you know, there's the way in which he's spoken about this, I think goes to kind of a more fundamental question on incentives, which is, you know, should incentives really only be provided if it really changes behavior? And I think it then means, like, what does changing behavior actually mean, and what does join mean of these RTOs and ISOs? So I think for areas where RTO membership isn't voluntary, I think that's an interesting question. You know, this is something that the commission has kind of open in their transmission incentive NOPR that hasn't been finalized, that the agency is still considering on the incentive side of thing. But I think the point that gets raised, and we don't hear it that often, but every once in a while we do, that kind of the actions that FERC is taking is really impacting RTOs and ISOs and raising more challenges onto them that are not being in those regions that are not being realized outside of them. I think is an important point to keep raising with the commissioners, and me and with FERC, and I think it's something that we need to keep an eye on. It is sometimes easier to take action that impacts just RTOs and ISOs, but that's easier for that's not necessarily warranted. So I think that's a good point.
Okay, great, thanks. And then I have one more question here. This is continuing on this notion about electrification, and it says, is FERC thinking about the need for highway charging to overcome range anxiety and speed up acceptance and adoption of electric vehicles?
That's it. I mean, we have electric vehicle tech conference coming up, not electrification tech conference. There'll be a panel on electric vehicles that I believe Commissioner Chatterjee will be leading. You know, I think that's true. I'm not sure if that's FERC or if that's more on the distribution side for the actual local utilities. That's an area I'm not totally clear on, but I think you know, the electrification across our economy is going to present all types of challenges, including increased demand. But you know, the infrastructure and range anxiety, I think that's spot on, and it's something that is going to need to be tackled. And I hope that, you know, that gets discussed at the upcoming electrification tech conference, and kind of looking forward to, which is, I don't have the date in front of me, but I believe it's in April. So I think it's coming up this next month. So it should be a good discussion.
I wanted to ask you about something else that we hear about off and on, and that's this, there's talk off and on of whether FERC is going to look to institute a transmission planning office of some sort. Some greet that news with a little bit more anxiety and trepidation perhaps than others. Curious as to whether there's any thinking along those lines. You know, how would it work if you were to do it? Would it be a standalone office or a subdivision with another office? Any thoughts on whether there's any traction to that kind of a concept or not?
So I know there's been a lot of interest in this, and I can only speak for my own view on it. But you know, I think there is a need for us to bring more transmission expertise in-house, particularly from industry. I think FERC could use, and I think we're likely to post some jobs to do exactly that. I think we probably need to bring in some more expertise on it. But in terms of setting up a whole office, it's a lot of administrative work to set up an entirely new office. I would rather put our efforts towards figuring out how to get the transmission reforms needed to ensure kind of the efficient build out of the transmission, the cost effective build out of the transmission system, rather than spending time trying to set up a new office at FERC. But that's just my perspective. I think, you know, setting up its own office is like a structural management question. I think if the question is, should FERC be prioritizing transmission? Should FERC bring in more expertise on transmission? Absolutely. Does it need to be its own office as compared to kind of working within the current office structure where, you know, we have some of that expertise already in areas like, you know, we have from the Office of Energy Policy Innovation, we have some excellent transmission folks there who can work with our general counsel's office and can kind of do that together. I think, you know, I don't think we need a new office to do this. I think setting it up would be a lot of work. I'm not sure that would be worth it. But I do think that we need to bring in some expertise and we need to get moving on pushing forward some of these priorities on transmission reforms.
Great. I'll just check with Andrew one more time. Andrew, are there any hands up that we missed?
No, sir. I don't believe so.
All right, great. Let me just ask, I'll sort of close out with one last question, which is, you know, from your perspective, is there anything that an organization like WIRES can do to help the commission with some of these issues? Are there any, I know a number of our members are now starting to plan meetings with the FERC commissioners, particularly since there are some new members on the commission and we have a new chairman. Is there anything that's particularly helpful for them to think about when they come in for those meetings, or is there something they should definitely not do or hold off on that you think might be helpful for them? So I'll just sort of wrap it up with that kind of a question for you.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, I think having the communication, the dialogue, bringing your perspective with the experience you have to the commission is super helpful. I think having those meetings and explaining, you know, whatever the concerns are, giving some examples. I think, you know, particularly for, you know, I've now been at FERC for like 6 years, I guess. You know, and before that, I spent some time in transmission planning meetings, and I had worked for a transmission owner. And that does give me some kind of insight personally when people bring some of these challenges here, because I can kind of think about that. And then it does mean that some of my examples are a little bit East Coast focused. But my point there is that, you know, people have all different backgrounds at the commission, but most of them have not recently, certainly, been in the industry working on building transmission, operating transmission, or kind of thinking about some of the challenges that the current environment is posing to kind of those efforts. So I think it's really helpful that you kind of have this dialogue with the commissioners. You can have those meetings with them. I think, you know, most of the commissioners are very open to kind of setting up these types of meetings and coming there, having that dialogue, kind of expressing your thoughts, and then providing any examples that are tangible, I think are really, really helpful, because I think it's those tangible examples that kind of stick with people when they kind of leave those meetings to understand like what kind of to get your point across. So sometimes things lend themselves better to tangible examples than others, but to the extent possible, I think that's a really helpful approach. And, you know, of course, please participate in the upcoming conferences that we're going to have, and please put in comments. Sometimes people in meetings make excellent points, and then we go work on orders, and I was like, we should bolster that with this argument that I was told, and then I find out that argument's not on the record, and we can't. So, you know, if you have, please put those into comments. We only can act on the record in which we have. So while initially we kind of get some feedback about what to do, once we start taking that action, you know, I really urge you to get your best thoughts into comments so that we can do something with it. And, you know, feel free to reach out to me too. I mean, sometimes it's hard to get onto, Rich's calendar. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to get onto, but if you have a pressing need, I think, or there's a time sensitive issue to it, you should feel free to reach out to me. I can always pull people from staff together to make sure that we're hearing you out. I think that type of dialogue is what's going to kind of help make sure that what we're doing is both beneficial and sustainable over time if we get the buy-in from the industry on it. So, you know, I really appreciate, Larry, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all, and I really hope you take me up on that invitation to come talk to us more about your specific perspectives and concerns.
Well, I think that's great advice. Certainly WIRES and its members can give plenty of real world practical experience, particularly in the transmission area that I think could be helpful for the commission. But Pamela, let me thank you for taking time out of your really busy schedule to come in and talk to us. We had a great attendance for this, a lot of really interesting questions, and appreciate your responses and your candor with us, and just taking the time to be with us today.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and stay tuned for our next presentation, which will be coming up sometime in May. All right, thanks, Pamela.
Bye.
Bye now.